So the New Zealand election study has been going for over 30 years. It's quite a useful source of longitudinal data on a number of questions that are of wide interest. So we've been doing this, varying sample sizes depending on how much money's been available. And it's all about behavior, attitudes, and opinion. It's also freely available for independent analysis. It's deposited in the Australian Data Archive, and it's widely used, very widely used. This, of course, means that it's possible for in-depth analysis to be done from all kinds of different theoretical directions. Compared to most political data in New Zealand, survey research that's done by commercial providers who don't release their data, and so consequently it's greatly underutilized. So, as I said, we've got longitudinal data on a series of quite interesting questions. We also use a panel. We go back to people who participated at the previous election, and they participate so we've got the, if you like, time t and t-1 for about half of the sample. And this makes it possible for us to make a few causal inferences, perhaps. We've oversampled Maori since 1993, and we've offered questionnaires in Maori online since 2020, and in Chinese as well in 2023. Our sampling base is the electoral roll. We send out questionnaires by mail. People return them, but there's also an online option for people to fill out their responses in that way. We've been part funded by the Electoral Commission since 2005. Prior to that, we had various other funders, and indeed we have a lot of funding sources. It's always been a problem getting funding, and it looks as though for the next election in 2026, it's going to be more serious. Here's a list of all the people who've been involved, some of whom, Peter Raymer, Charles Crothers, we've lost, unfortunately. We've had a lot of collaborators over time, and in terms of the funding, you can see here that we've had, we got quite significant funding from the old Foundation for Research, Science and Technology over the transition to MNP. But since then, we've been funded by a variety of universities and some sources overseas as well, largely because we're open for researchers to buy in a module of questions, so long as it's related to the broad topic of elections. We've been able to patch together funding quite successfully over the years, but as I've mentioned, it's becoming more and more difficult. So, is the NZES worth persisting with? Well, it's an ongoing record of changes in political behaviour and public opinion over 30 years. It's probably of interest to some people. We've got anonymised microdata, which is available for people to analyse, not just in New Zealand, but around the world. We collaborate in an international research group, the Comparative Study of Electoral Systems. So this means that data from New Zealand gets included in an international data set, allowing people to look at comparative political behaviour questions. Our data is being increasingly used by data journalists in New Zealand. A few links there. And quite recently, we had a story on us in the New Zealand Listener, and Henry Cook, who's recently returned to New Zealand, is now writing for the Post, and he does quite a bit of analysis of our data. The 2023 data has just been released for analysis. Some of it's also appeared in Newsroom. Yeah. So there's uptake. And also, of course, there are plenty of issues about which we ask questions, which are very relevant for the kind of public commentary that informs political debate in New Zealand. We usually report on our findings to the Justice Select Committee after each election as part of their inquiry into elections. We've made successive submissions about the performance of the MMP electoral system, and we can also make links with other sources of data, particularly the social media data, in terms of the update, the questions we ask about people's media uptake. So, scholarly impact, 10 books on successive New Zealand elections. Auckland University Press initially, ANU Press has published more recently. The availability of our data means that it's available for student research. So we've had master's theses, so we've had PhD theses which have drawn on it. And there's a book that some of you may know, Louise Humpage's book on policy change and social citizenship in New Zealand, published back in 2014, which used longitudinal NZES data about attitudes to social welfare in a very useful and interesting way. Steady stream of articles published in international journals, mostly of interest to political scientists rather than the broader social science community, but on the other hand, some of the questions we address are more widely relevant. And of course, our data is also used in the CSES, and I haven't bothered to count the number of journal articles which have used New Zealand data as part of studies of behaviour internationally. Major theme, of course, has been in the earlier stages the consequences of the change to MMP, but of course many of these are still playing out. It's not as if something like this, a big change in the electoral system, has short-term consequences, but it also has long-term consequences, and we're still looking at those. Current and future research pathways. Well, the long-term dynamics of political trust in New Zealand, there's been quite a lot of concern about this recently. We have data. Changing patterns of electoral turnout, again, we have data which allows us to get insights into this. The effects of changes in media content and exposure. We have questions, as I mentioned, on media exposure, questions about people's use of social media and so on and so forth, which, as I mentioned, we link into social media analysis. There's questions about effective and attitudinal polarization. Are we becoming more divided? Again, we've got longitudinal data which allows us to be able to address that question. Changes in political efficacy over time. How responsive do people think governments have been over the past 30 years? We have the data. Changes in orientations to political parties. Been changes in the New Zealand party system as a result of MMP. We still, quite remarkably, have quite high levels of party identification internationally. But we wouldn't know that, of course, if we didn't have this data and we weren't able to fit it into an international framework. We also have panel components, as again I mentioned, which allow for some causal inferences to be made on a T-1 basis. And as increasingly we're moving to having participants respond to questions online, it means that there's more potential for survey experiments. We've got a number of challenges. Mail is getting more problematic as a means of delivery. We've looked at moving to courier delivery, but that's far too expensive, and we basically have less money, not more money, which we'd need for that. We want people to move online, but most people still prefer to fill out their questionnaire in hard copy. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to go online much more than in the past, although I think it would be good to provide a hard copy option for some people. We've got declining response rates. We really should pay respondents to try to encourage them to participate. Budgets are always, we never know. The Electoral Commission has been very supportive over the years, and until recently Victoria University was, but not this time apparently. So our applications for funding to Victoria University to fund the 2026 study have been turned down. So we have problems in terms of a paucity of quantitative skills, particularly among political scientists in New Zealand. We have a concentration at Victoria, but there aren't many elsewhere in the country. I've mentioned the response rates. We have oversampled Maori, so we have reasonably good Maori data, but we are aware that our response rates for other ethnic minorities are not as good as they should be, and we will have to put efforts into that if we are in fact able to continue. We can do this by oversampling. Because we have the electoral roll, it is possible to sample ethnic minorities by name, and that's probably the approach we will take if we can. As I've mentioned, we are now struggling to find funding for 2026. So what can we offer? What are the advantages that we do have in terms of doing this research in New Zealand? We're very fortunate compared to colleagues in other countries that we've got a high quality computerized electoral roll from which we can sample. And we've been very fortunate to be able to use Compass to administer the survey for us over the years. And some respects, things are getting easier by way of artificial intelligence, advances in textual analysis and so on and so forth, data capture, coding. Potentially we can use AI to reduce some of the work associated with those things. We do have the advantage of the support in the media. And there is some acknowledgement of the value of the NZES, but the problem is that mainstream media in New Zealand is like social science researchers struggling to support itself, and they like to use our data, but they don't want to pay for it. As I mentioned, we do have a core of researchers at the Herenga Waka, Victoria University. We do want to continue with this study. So we've got a lot of data over 30 years, and I can happy to share some of it with you. And in particular, I'd like to share some data we have which pertains to something of a moral panic which appears to have emerged among the commentariat in New Zealand over the past year or two. The idea that there is some kind of crisis of political trust. Mm-hmm. Disturbing levels of support for strong leadership, declining social cohesion, declining trust in politicians and institutions. Now, the problem is that a lot of this data is based on one-off surveys or surveys that go back only a short period of time. There's a Stats New Zealand survey which goes back to 2014, but we have data that goes back further. I also have to comment on the fact that a lot of the commentary about this data that's been produced recently doesn't appear to pay any attention to the previous research or previous data or even the academic literature on these matters. So, as one example, concerns about social cohesion in New Zealand, which the concept of interpersonal trust is arguably one of the most significant. The New Zealand Values Survey, which was last run in 2019 and struggled to find funding and hasn't been run since, actually shows increasing interpersonal trust in New Zealand from 1989 up to the last time it was put in the field in 2019, from only 38% trusted other people in 1918. By 2019, it had recovered to 59%. So if we have a crisis of social cohesion in New Zealand, we obviously had a much worse one 30 years ago. Here's NZES data on this question of strong leadership. So the question, agreement or disagreement with the statement, a few strong leaders could make this country better than all the wars and talk. So something which measures to some extent the level of authoritarianism in the mass public. And what we can see here is actually very little change over time, a lot of bouncing around in the early period, then apparently a reduction in authoritarian attitudes up until the 2020 election. And yes, a bounce upwards again in 2023, but no worse than previous periods. The period of the key national government might be seen by some people as a period of perhaps normality or stability or whatever, but if that was indeed the case, we are back in that general region in terms of authoritarian attitudes. Satisfaction with democracy. We're told that confidence in democracy is declining, and our data does not bear this out at all. We started in 1996, so the first MMP election. Unfortunately, we didn't collect data before that, which would have been more interesting. There's an interesting drop here, which was actually a midterm survey which we conducted when the first coalition government under MMP collapsed. And so there was a bit of a drop then, but since then it's been pretty flat. 2020, satisfaction with democracy went up very significantly. And this was almost certainly because of the government's very effective response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's dropped back a bit since then, only back to what one might call the mean. There's been a regression to the mean. We saw much the same thing in turnout. But perhaps the most interesting data, and here I have to bring in data from other sources because the key question the NZES stopped asking in 2011, but fortunately it was picked up by the Institute for Governments and Policy Studies. And as a result, we do have a reasonably decent time series on this question. You can trust the government to do what is right most of the time. Now, this is a classic trust in government question. It's been asked in the United States since the 1960s. And in the United States, it shows this massive decline from relatively decent levels in the 1960s through to something like 15%, I believe, agreeing with that recent findings. So here we've got the New Zealand data. The NZES takes us up to the 2011 election, an increase in political trust, which one would possibly want to interpret as a response to the consolidation of the MMP electoral system. The IGPS takes the data set, takes the question onwards, and basically finds a continuation of a flat trend. The reason we stopped asking it in 2011 was because we thought the trend was pretty flat. We should have continued, obviously. IGPS, then this is IGPS data, and it shows political trust increasing very significantly under the Ardern government, both before the pandemic and immediately after it. And more recently, of course, we see it coming back down, but it's only back down to the level that it was under the key government. Mm-hmm. So for there to be some kind of a crisis in political trust in New Zealand seems to me to be not borne out by the evidence. So to take action. Longitudinal analysis puts current changes in perspective. We would like to continue to be able to run the study in order to continue it. Comparative analysis is also very useful. We'd like to be able to keep New Zealand on the map in terms of research in comparative social science. It's great that the ISSP is going to continue. The New Zealand Value Survey, which is a part of the World Value Survey, as I mentioned, its last appearance in the field was in 2019. I don't believe there is anybody now working on trying to put it into the latest wave. And it's a shame if it's not. One of the key points, of course, is that we provide open access to this data on matters of keen political interest. And anybody there are certain provisos on use of the data, but essentially anybody who has the right motives can get hold of the data and use it and ask whatever questions they want of it. And of course, this includes graduate students wanting to write theses and also data journalists. And it also provides, from one election to the next, an in-depth understanding of the contours of public opinion, which allows us to evaluate the extent to which governments can be said to have any kind of policy mandate. I think that's very important, personally.
You're mentioning that there's still a strong desire for hard copies and stuff at the moment. Is that related to kind of the demographic that the majority of people who vote in elections tend to be older generations compared to the younger generations? Is there a trend there, like with the reluctance to use?
I think that's part of it. I think that's part of it.
And I was wondering also, because I noticed in our local community, like there's local drop-off points for our local election papers. I was like wondering, would a way around the issue with postage and stuff be to have collection points at like maybe pubs or Rye or something? But I don't know, like the numbers might not be worth doing.
No, I think still there's still places that people can post things back. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question, why so many people still prefer to do hard copy. And I mean, personally, I can understand. I mean, I'm of the older generation, so your point might apply to me. But on the other hand, I use IT technology a hell of a lot, and I spend most of my day probably sitting in front of a computer, and filling out a questionnaire online is not really a big deal for me. But sometimes it's more comfortable to actually sit at the table and do something in hard copy, and maybe something like this. I don't know, but anyway, I think we're not going to be able to do that. I think it would be good if we can continue to offer people a hard copy option, because what we did find, we were trying to push people to web last time, and we did find, I would say I maybe got about 10 people who, when they only received the invitation to fill it out on the web, said that they have a hard copy questionnaire, and they were actually going to get one in the second wave anyway. But there were clearly some people who just said that they don't do online, and this was mostly older people, obviously.
I just have a question about the high levels of party identification. Like, what is the significance of that, and is that related in any way to the people answering that there's about the strong leaders, like rather than laws and policy?
That's an interesting question. I'd be happy to test it in the data. I think the high levels of party identification are interesting, if only because obviously at the moment support is moving away from the major parties towards the minor parties, and we're seeing a little bit of a consolidation of party identification to minor parties, which actually hasn't happened until recently. More generally about party identification, I do think in New Zealand it's rather soft, in that people are prepared to say that they feel generally close to a political party. But that doesn't necessarily mean the kind of strong attachment that the theory which justifies this concept, which mostly comes out of the United States, is assuming. So I'm a bit of a party identification skeptic in some respects. I think it's highly endogenous with vote, but there's a huge debate about this, which I'm currently trying to address in the paper at the moment. Yes.
Have there been any questions addressing the theme of the prevalence or lack thereof of what some people might call strategic voting, or voting not aligned with your political views necessarily, but what you think might game the MMP system to get the outcome you want? We did an article using 1996 data, which looked at strategic voting, and other people have looked at it since. I mean, by and large, we find that strategic voting is usually quite well founded. People like using the system in the way that it can lend itself to be used, and sometimes in good ways and sometimes perhaps not so good ways. because it can also discourage people from voting for a party that might align with their views, right? If they think it's a waste of vote or something like that. Which I think is probably one of the issues with you.
Well, I mean, that's a function of the electoral system rather than the ability to vote strategically.
Yeah.
Although electoral systems are obviously structured that. Huge literature on all of this. There was questions about, yes.
Just curious with the funding, how much funding did you normally need per cycle? Sort of a couple of $100,000?
Well, to do it properly, I'd like $250,000. But we're not going to get that.
I was thinking of the was it the study running through Massey around older people's wellbeing, health wellbeing and retirement study, which is quite similar. Male hours costing about $200,000.
Yeah.
Similar, quite similar cohort.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'd like to. I could do something with 200. I think we'll be lucky to. And I think the budget we got from Compass, Martin's in the room, he can address that, is about 180,000. But that was based on paying participants $20, which we think would. It's a good thing to do, arguably, but it also does help with the response rate. So if we take that off, 120,000 was the budget that we were thinking of. We've currently got 45,000, which is pretty much guaranteed. So I think I'm not giving up entirely. I think it's possible we might be able to prize some cash out of Victoria University if they've got any to spare, which they might towards the end of the year. You never know. And there are other possibilities. We have got money from offshore in the past. I'm thinking of emailing some colleagues in the UK to see if there's some kind of, we might be able to get a small grant from the British Academy, which would, we got one of those before, yeah. Sorry.
You might get some from the US because there's certain solutions with it.
Well, no.
Euro access might be potential with their crossover in their research.
Yeah, the problem with the European research is it's hugely bureaucratic.
Yeah.
And it requires sort of in-depth networking, a lot of time, a lot of effort.
What about the approaching the media company?
Well, as I said, they love the data, but they don't want to pay for it. Now, we might possibly be able to squeeze a bit out of them. I don't know. It's worth a try.
Tell them they need a paywall. You'll put up a paywall. Sponsor that.
Well, we don't release our data to the public, if you like, for about a year or 18 months after we've got it. And that just means that we have time to publish it, and also to make sure that we find out any of the problems with it that you can only identify once you start digging into it in depth. But we have allowed people to pay for advanced access. Indeed, one or two of the political parties used to pay for advanced access to the NZES in the past.